Well, today I'm going to give you guys a little bit of a rundown on some things you might be able to look at if you've got one that's throwing rich codes or if it's running rich. Back when I used to work at the Ford dealer before OBD2 came along, I learned to measure the voltages at the various different sensors. Of course, the map sensor on those Fords was measured in hertz. And I learned as I measured those voltages what a good car was supposed to look like. Now, if one came in blowing black smoke, you know, there's several different things that you could look at. Oxygen sensors like to die in those days in a slightly different way than they do now. And, you know, the oxygen sensors on the cars, you know, 15, 20 years ago were almost like a spark plug. Periodically, they just got tired and needed to be replaced. And a lot of them still do that. These air fuel sensors are a little different with the pump cells in them, and they got to get to 1400 degrees before they start working and all of that. But the simple fact is, there was a Chrysler one time that came, and it had those old one-wire oxygen sensors that depended on where the oxygen sensor was threaded into the exhaust for ground. And one of the things I had learned from Ellen Smith when I went to General Motors School in 1981 was that you could take your hand and put it on the battery, and you could touch the terminal. If you could get, you know, make contact with the terminal that went to the engine controller from the oxygen sensor, you could fool the engine controller into thinking the oxygen sensor was reading rich by running that little bit of voltage through your body. And so I had, when I was at the Ford place, I wound up getting a Chrysler to work on that I didn't have any books on or anything, and I applied that. It was black smoking, and I like to look and see. I would check with my meter and see, is the oxygen sensor reading lean while it's running rich, or is it reading rich and running rich? Because that gives you two different directions to go. If it's reading lean and running rich, the sensor may be the problem, or, you know, wiring related to the sensor. If it's reading rich and running rich, then you need to look upstream of the oxygen sensor. It's not really very complicated. Well, this one here, it had one of those little bullet style connectors. I mean, that's how old this car was. And when I touched the battery terminal, and I like to lick my finger and touch the battery terminal, lick my fingers and touch that little bullet terminal that went to the engine controller from the oxygen sensor, unplugged it, and when I did that, the black smoke cleared up. And instantly, without even checking voltage, I knew the oxygen sensor was the problem. But let's move on to some stuff that you're more likely to run into. Rich codes point to negative fuel trims, meaning fuel is being subtracted to balance the mix. So if it's subtracting fuel, it's picked up on a condition where there's too much fuel in there, and it wants to try to keep it balanced, because it basically what it's shooting for. Within a certain range, it can be bad enough so that it can't deal with it. But these things it's very, very sensitive in that whenever it sees that it's out of balance one way or another, initially, like if something happens all of a sudden, the short fuel trim will begin to count in the direction it needs to fix that. And then the long fuel trim will pick up, it's watching the short fuel trim. And the long fuel trim doesn't operate as quickly as the short fuel trim does, but it keeps ratcheting up a little bit at a time until it gets to the point that the short fuel trim returns to zero. So the best thing you can look at if you think you've got a problem, or if you've got a code for whatever, I mean for rich or lean or whatever, is look at the long fuel trim and see what the long fuel trim is showing you, because the short fuel trim is not reliable at this point. You can look at the oxygen sensors, but if the long fuel trim has made those course adjustments to keep everything balanced at 14.7 to 1, the oxygen sensor is probably going to look normal. Now, occasionally they have new codes in there now where if one's running sluggish, you know, the oxygen sensor is not switching like it should, it'll tell you a slower response or something like that. But if you think you've fixed one, that's what I put in this little yellow chalk print down here. If you think you've fixed a problem, like if your fuel trim was way off, and if you just you know, fixed a vacuum leak if the fuel trim was positive, or if you've done something that you think, or if you're trying to check and see if you've done something to impact the fuel trim in the other way, what you can do is you're going to clear the fuel trim out of there. You're going to take there's scan tools, some of the scan tools will say reset fuel trim, or you can take the battery terminal off or whatever. If you think, make your repair, if you think you got it fixed, clear the fuel trim, crank it up, watch it when it closes loop. If that short fuel trim begins to walk, then you know it's not fixed. If the short fuel trim hovers around 0 after you've made your repair, when before your long fuel trim was way off, see, because when you reset it, your long fuel trim will be on 0 and your short fuel trim will be on 0. As soon as it closes loop, it's going to try to correct for whatever it sees wrong. And so that's what this is about. Now, newer platforms use Lambda readings. Now, the screen you're seeing here is not a scan tool screen. This screen is a 5-gas exhaust analyzer that I had when I was at college. I got one of these. These things are really, really pricey. You know, it's not anything that you're going to pull money out of your hip pocket and pay for unless you're a kind of a wealthy dude. But this one here, I was basically doing some testing with this sensor here. I mean, with this exhaust gas analyzer, and it's about the size of a scan tool. But you got to put you got to let it warm up. You got to put let the engine warm up, and so that there's not steam coming out the exhaust. You don't want any water being drawn into this thing in the way of heavy steam or vapor or whatever. Engine got to be nice and warm. This thing's got to be warmed up and ready. You stick the probe in the exhaust and it begins to read the concentrations of different exhaust gases. Now this one here was just like it needed to be. If you look, your Lambda value, which is kind of like fuel trim, but it's sort of figured a different way. If Lambda is 1, that's the optimum reading that you're going to get. See, this one right here, basically, looking at the exhaust gas, this thing could tell what Lambda was, which is very interesting. If the mixture is too rich, Lambda will go below 1. If it's too lean, Lambda will go above 1. So if it's subtracting fuel, you'll see a number that's lower than 1 on your Lambda. A lot of your scan tools read Lambda too. So just be prepared for that. But this exhaust gas analyzer could tell you even on one, no matter what it was, if it was OBD1, if it didn't have any OBD, if it had a carburetor or whatever, it could give you an idea of what the Lambda was by looking at that. Of course, it's also looking, let me get my little pen fired up here. It's also looking at CO2. CO2 needs to be high, which you can see it is, and everybody else needs to be low. You didn't have any CO, you didn't have any O2 much, you had very little hydrocarbons, and you didn't have any NOx. See that? So basically this is a really good running one, and I could show you some more screens of ones that weren't right and all that, but the numbers are different. You can see what the numbers are supposed to look like. Now these here are the basics. An ideal air fuel mixture is 14.7 to 1 by weight, 9,000 to 1 by volume. So for every gallon of gas you burn by volume, you're going to be burning 9,000 gallons of air. Spark triggers a combustion. Hydrocarbons get oxidized, they create heat, and the inert nitrogen that's in here, which is 78% of what's in the atmosphere, expands and pushes the piston down, which turns the crank, which gives you your power. And what you're getting out of this thing is you're getting water, and you're getting CO2, and you're getting some CO, you're getting some hydrocarbons, you're getting oxides of nitrogen, and there's several different compounds of that. So this is what's basically coming out. Now what you want to do is have the 14.7 to 1 as near to that perfect setting as possible, because if it's really, really close to that perfect setting, you have very little of these other things coming out and a lot of CO2, which is what you're after, because we breathe out CO2, and so does every animal on the planet that breathes out CO2, and every plant on the planet breathes in CO2. So we're basically supporting plant life with CO2, and our cars basically are putting out a lot of CO2. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Running rich means a higher, which is if it's running too rich, beyond what the fuel trim or system can handle, you're going to have CO, which is 1 molecule of carbon and 1 molecule of oxygen instead of 1 and 2. hydrocarbons, which is no molecules of oxygen and a molecule of hydrocarbon. A balanced mix means high CO2 and low CO and HC. You're making water though when you burn the fuel. So this is basically the most prominent items that are coming out of here. You got your hydrocarbons, carbon monoxide, H2O. These are the harmful gases you're trying to take care of. You notice these go into the catalyst, the light-off catalyst, which typically it's going to be mounted really close to the engine on just about every vehicle out there. On a lot of your 4 cylinders now, it's crammed right up against the engine, and so that the manifold just pours the exhaust right into it, and it gets hot really fast. Gasoline direct injection cars actually will put more fuel in there to heat it up quicker. Of course, they know what the temperature is because it can be inferred by the stuff that they're measuring. But anyway, these are inputs after the burn. This one right here, actually, this is the input that the PCM uses to determine what the fuel delivery should be. And then it reads the gas again, and it's making a circle. That's your closed loop fuel control. Now, whenever you don't have closed loop, it's wide open throttle, a really cold engine. Of course, most of them are going into closed loop really fast nowadays. But if you're at wide open throttle, or there's something bad enough wrong so that it knows it can't trust the oxygen sensors, like if they've gone completely flat, it will run in open loop, and it uses everything else it can to run as clean as it can. But the oxygen sensor is basically the test that it looks at the most. After these gases go through this light-off cat, you might notice you've got HC, NOx, CO. And look what comes out of here. You got HC, CO, and N2. One of the things I left out that's back here is you do have oxygen back here. You got oxygen in this pipe here. I forgot to put that in there. And so these hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide, they go through here basically unchanged. But they go through this oxidation catalyst, and it adds 2 molecules of oxygen to the HC, 1 molecule of oxygen to CO, and then the nitrogen, basically is unchanged. Now, the reason that we make oxides of nitrogen is because combustion chamber temperatures, when the burn is going on during that 24 or so degrees of burn time, that's heats up that nitrogen and shoves the piston down. Whenever you heat oxygen and nitrogen up like that in a combustion process, it's going to lock oxygen and nitrogen together in various different compounds, and they need to be split back apart. So your oxides of nitrogen are handled by this oxidation catalyst. But carbon, you notice CO2 is the most plentiful thing that's supposed to be coming out of there. And that's just the way that's supposed to work. And that's the best way for it to work, and there's nothing wrong with it. A clean running internal combustion engine is true green energy. 14.3% there. Look, see, we're getting carbon dioxide. Did you know that 95% of what you see growing out of the ground in the way of a tree or anything else comes out of thin air? Only a very small amount of it, like 5%, comes out of the dirt. Of course, you got water, you got some minerals coming out of the dirt, maybe some fertilizer, but mostly you've got sunlight and you've got carbon dioxide, and that's photosynthesis. That's what makes plants grow. It needs the carbon dioxide. You take away the carbon dioxide, you ain't green. You're going to be brown, and you're going to have dead plants and trees everywhere. Of course, we're not going to take away all the carbon dioxide. There's probably going to be some. But if you have a dome out there, like I read somewhere about Arizona where they had this dome where they closed this in and they pumped it, they gave it an intense amount of carbon dioxide in there, and they planted these little tomatoes that are usually like the little sweet 100s, and those tomatoes grew as big as baseballs, and there were just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. Because CO2 is good for plants, it's good for food, it's and all that. But so you're basically might have noticed that your exhaust is actually, a lot of the times, of course, your exhaust on every vehicle is going to come out on the opposite side of the car to where the gas tank is, unless you got dual exhaust, right? Okay, so if the gas tank is on the left side, it's going to blow this exhaust out over the grass. CO2 has got a atomic weight of 44. Oxygen and nitrogen are 16, 14, and 16. So it's heavier than air anyway. And so it settles into the grass, and that's how it feeds everything. So you might notice they keep mowing the roads You know, if carbon dioxide was a really bad thing, the exhaust of the cars would be killing the grass, not making it greener. Okay, so one way or another, I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. Now, PCM inputs can be skewed, mass airflow, map, Baro, ECT. You know, I have seen Baro sensors that usually when a Baro sensor fails, it will actually fail lean, and it will cause the fuel trim to be increased, right? Okay, so if it fails lean and the fuel trim goes up, you know, it's thinking it's at a higher altitude than it is, and so it puts less fuel in there. And then the oxygen sensor picks up on that, dials the fuel trim up to balance everything, and you know, that's kind of the way it goes. But since it's monitoring the incoming air, any kind of air leak between the mass airflow sensor and the engine will cause issues. Now, air leaks from in the air filter or in front of the mass airflow sensor, you know, will not typically cause that kind of problem. But if you've got air leaks in the plenum or something like that, you're going to have some issues here. Now, a lot of vehicles now have a map sensor and a mass airflow sensor both. The map sensor is a good data point for EGR flow. If you got EGR flowing, then your map sensor is when EGR is flowing, it lowers the engine vacuum a little. So if the PCM is watching this map sensor, it turns on the EGR, opens it up a little bit. It watches for map to respond to that, and it kind of knows it's flowing. Of course, it has other ways too. It can also look at the oxygen sensor, because the oxygen sensor, you're replacing some of the oxygen with inert gas. You're going to see the oxygen sensor drift a little bit toward the rich side. But intake air temperature and engine coolant temperature are factored in, along with throttle and movement and position. If you started a vehicle, let's say that your intake air temperature sensor was open, and a lot of the enhanced, you know, in all of these engine controllers, you got an enhanced room and you got an OBD2 room in there, basically a generic room in there. Sometimes I've actually, and it's very, very rare, but I have actually cleared a code out of the enhanced room and still had a check engine light and backed out and went into the generic OBD2 room, found that same code still stored in the OBD2 room, and that was clearing them with the scan tool, not taking the battery cable off. But anyway, the long and the short of it is, you start out with let's say the temperature outside is 90 degrees, right? And let's say your intake air temperature sensor is on your generic side of your tool. If you look at generic, it's reading 40 below. But if you go to the enhanced side of the tool, the factory side, it's going to substitute a value of like 100 degrees in there. Okay, so if the actual temperature outside and the substituted temperature are very close, then you're probably going to have a fairly normally feeling system. You'll have a check engine light and a code for the intake air temperature sensor. You know, like if a rat's chewed the wire or something, you know, it'll be reading 40 below zero, like that's what it was. So as the temperatures change to the point to where that 100 degrees doesn't agree with what the actual temperature is, and the engine coolant, like this is most prevalent on a cold engine when you first try to start it up. Let's say the temperature was 90 yesterday and suddenly it dropped to 40 today, and 90 was really close to that substituted value for the intake air temperature yesterday, but it's not today. It's going to put all kinds of extra gas in there whenever you try to start it up. It may even flood the, you know, foul the spark plugs, not start at all. So there's a lot of little nuances of knowing kind of how these things affect the air-fuel mix and even cold enrichment and stuff like that. Now, fuel delivery versus unwanted fuel. Now, if the inputs are skewed, the fuel delivery can be wrong for that reason. But what if all the inputs are right? What if the fuel pressure is right? You know, sometimes I had seen fuel pressure. I talked one time about this Cadillac Escalade that was an 07 model that the girl brought in there. And you've probably heard this before, so just tone me out if you have. But this girl came in and she says, "Hey, I've got a traction control light on my Cadillac Escalade." And so I went in there and I found a network code. I don't remember what the network code was, but the only code in that system was a network code. I said, well, that's weird. And so and we weren't doing a lot of network stuff at that point in time. And I said, you probably ought to take this to Cadillac place. They probably got a reflash or something. I didn't look it up on Identifix or anything. I just basically sent her to the Cadillac place. So she goes over there And she comes back and she wouldn't let them do anything. And I said, what'd they tell you? She says, they told me I had a bad fuel pump and my fuel pressure was really high, and that was causing the light. And I thought, what? So we got traction control and they're talking about fuel pressure? I don't understand, I don't know about that. And so this particular one has got the fuel pressure regulator built on the pump down in the tank, right? And they wanted $1,800 to put a fuel pump in it. So she didn't have $1,800 she wanted to give them, so she comes back over there and we check the fuel pressure, and sure enough, it's 160 pounds. I'm thinking, my goodness, there is a problem here. And so we got her a $425 fuel pump from Advanced Auto Parts, and we popped it in there and got the pressure down where it was supposed to be. Lo and behold, the code was gone and the traction control light was gone. I don't know what pocket to put that in, but I saw that happen. This is not hearsay, y'all. All right, so we got to figure out if we've got hydrocarbons coming from somewhere else. Why are those hydrocarbons where are they coming from? Why are they being put in there? And what do we need to do about that? Now, fuel delivery versus unwanted fuel. The PCV system is a possible source of fuel vapor if the oil hadn't been changed in a long time. You might remember the story I told you about my dad. My mom had a 91 Chrysler, and it was a New Yorker, and he said that there was a power loss light on, and I went to switch the key on 3 times and got that thing to flash out the code, and it was a code 17, and I told him, I said, hey, this thing needs a thermostat. And he said, well, I can put a thermostat in it. He had his own shop for long years. So he goes and he puts a thermostat in it, and then he drives it back. Everything's fine. So about 10 days later, he said, I'm gonna change the oil in this car. So he changes the oil in it, and then he calls me and he's kind of frustrated, and he goes, all I did was change the oil and now it won't idle. So, well, he had not changed, he had a rich running condition because he had one running too cold. It had contaminated the fuel, the oil with fuel, and it was pulling that through the PCV system. It had skewed the adaptive fuel trim so far that when that expected fuel was no longer in the oil, the car wouldn't idle. It was like a carburetor valve adjustment. Now, it had multi-point fuel injection. And I told him, I said, take the battery terminal off for a little bit and then put it back on and see if it didn't idle then. And so he did. Now, a lot of the time on some of these Dodges, because of this adaptive learning, I've seen Dodge pickup trucks where somebody would change the battery and it wouldn't idle until they drove it around for a while, and then it would learn to idle again. That's because the throttle body's dirty. So if you're going to change the battery out, you may as well go ahead and clean your throttle body out too. Not a bad idea. But anyway, adaptive learning was very confusing when it first came out. There was a lot of issues with that and all. So another potential source would be the EVAP system. Now, if somebody has saturated the evaporative canister by packing the fuel tank, that can cause a rich condition. I have seen that on more than one occasion. What typically happens, this one guy that had this Dodge, it was an 03 model Dodge Dakota that his wife drove, and periodically it would be sitting there idling and it would sort of fumble around and stumble a little bit or do something wacky with the idle. It didn't really cause any problem for them other than the fact that they didn't like what it was doing. So he brings it over there, I plug the scan tool in, I pull up a bunch of stuff and I'm watching it. And I noticed when it starts purging the evaporative system, when it turns on the purge solenoid and it starts pulling purge gases out of the evaporative canister, drawing fresh air through the evaporative canister to get rid of the vapor that is stored in there from the gas tank, it would basically it would slug it, to where it was having, all of a sudden it had too much gas, and the idle speed control would correct for that. And so I says, George, have you been packing the gas into this tank when you fill it up? Do you go click, 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 and keep trying to get more and more gas in it? And he goes, yeah, I always do that. I said, stop doing that, this problem will go away. And he did. There was another lady, this lady that called me one time when I was working at the Ford place, and she says, I've got a problem with my Windstar or whatever it was she was driving, and it was a minivan, and she says ever so often it would stumble and almost die, and then the idle speed control would kick up and it would almost lunge and crash into the car in front of her. And so without even looking at the vehicle, I says, do you pack the gas into your gas tank when you gas it up, or do you stop after it clicks off? And she said, I always pack it in there. And I said, stop doing that and you'll stop having that problem. Now, it's not going to be exactly the same on every vehicle, but the purge valve is a normally closed valve. And when the PCM operates, usually it operates it on a duty cycle. It'll go tit, 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 or something like that. Now, if this purge valve is always open, and it's not supposed to be, if for any reason it's always open, like if it's just malfunctioned on the inside and it's open all the time, when you gas it up, this vapor from this tank will actually push a whole bunch of vapor through here. It'll go into the intake, and it will put enough in there so that it will condense, and whenever you go to start it, it will wet the plugs and make it hard to start. Like you'll spin it, spin it, spin it, spin it, spin it, and I've seen that on all kinds of cars. I've seen it on Fords, I've seen it on Chevys, I've seen it on these little Hyundais and stuff like that. It's got those little purge valves. It's a real simple looking little thing. There's not much to it. It's just a very simple little valve. It's got a hose going through it and 2 wires connected to it. The vent solenoid now is normally open, and it lets the it's basically going to let air come in whenever purge is going on. So it's pulling this fresh air in to purge the vapor, runs it through the manifold, and the different cells that the computer uses to determine what it's going to do with the fuel trim, some of those are called purge-free cells, and some of them are not purge-free cells. It knows if it's in a cell where purging is going to be taken on its little programming map. It knows that if it's purging, it has to factor in extra fuel. And so if there's too much extra fuel coming in, it will move to a purge-free cell and stop purging. But sometimes that doesn't happen quick enough to prevent some sort of a little wacky thing. It may start purging it out. The older ones basically had the EGR was fed through a thermal vacuum switch in the water, so that the EGR would not get any vacuum unless the engine was warm. And they would have the purge teed into that, and it had a little diaphragm that had ported vacuum going to it, like the EGR. And whenever you had EGR, you had purge at the same time, basically. That was on the really early ones. I hadn't seen anything like that since my word, since carburetors. But the simple fact is, purge, canisters have been around a long time. Now, this vent solenoid has only been there since OBD2, because they wanted to be able to close the vent solenoid, and they wanted to be able to apply a little bit of manifold vacuum on the whole system, and then they lock it in there, and they look with there's a pressure sensor in the gas tank, little 3-wire pressure sensor, and it's basically not a lot of vacuum. It's like water vacuum, which is very, very faint vacuum, but if it leaks up, then they know you got some issues there. All right, let me see if we can move on here. Leaky injectors are unwanted fuel that come from somewhere that's not commanded. Now, if you've got I have seen engine controllers where they would have the trigger wire on the injector internally shorted. The wires to go into the injector can be shorted against the frame, or the injector itself, like in the one that you see here. This one here, this is an injector off of a 93 Jeep Wrangler that I worked on, and it was blowing just an ugly wet mist. You could put your hand by the exhaust pipe, and it would just wet your hand with gasoline, because it was just blowing straight through there. What was odd about that was when I hooked the scope up to it, the cylinder that this injector was feeding had a really high spike on it, which seems counterintuitive to me, but anyway. But a dripping injector will cause that too. Now, typically what a dripping injector will do is it'll show up when you first start it. It can make it start hard. There was a Thunderbird I saw one time with a V6 in it that, whenever it was working right, one of those Thunderbirds, you just breathe on the key and it fires up. But this guy was having it spinning, and it would spin a full 40 seconds, it seemed like, before it would ever fire up. When it finally fired up, it ran okay. And what I found out on his was when I pulled the injectors out of it, I looked at all 6 of the injectors, and no fewer than 3 of those injectors, the tips were clean on them. On the other ones were all dirty. The clean tips mean the injectors have been leaking and it's washed all the crud off of them. You can also crank it up, and if it's misfiring on one cylinder, switch it off real quick, pull the spark plugs out, one of the plugs is going to have soot on it if it's a dripping injector. And then you pull the fuel rail, try not to, pull the injectors out of the fuel rail so gas runs down there. Pull the injectors out of there and look at the tips of the injectors. Chances are the one that is the one for that plug that was real sooty, and you got to shut it off while it's still skipping now. The one that injector will be squeaky clean on the end instead of being sort of grungy and dirty like the rest of them. And that's how you know you got a leaking injector on those. Fuel pressure decay after engine shutdown is not supposed to happen. It's usually a fuel pump issue, but it can indicate one or more leaking injectors or a bad fuel pressure regulator, which a fuel pressure regulator can basically leak the fuel back to the tank. That's kind of rare. Almost every time it's going to be the fuel pump if you got fuel pressure decay. That causes it to start hard when it's hot. My Explorer has that problem right now. And if you suspect it's got a problem like that, you switch the key on about 4 times, bring the pressure up, and then if it starts up a lot faster that way, you know that in all likelihood you got the little check valve in the fuel pump that has failed and it's not holding fuel on the rail, and it winds up boiling the fuel in the rail because the fuel tries to expand, it goes back in there, you got air bubbles in the rail, and you're trying to push them through the injectors when you're starting. But if you switch it on several times, that pressure comes up in the rail, and that's what I do. I ain't putting a fuel pump in my Explorer for that because I know what's going on. I just switch the thing on 3 or 4 times, and then it fires up normally. But if I don't, if I parked it hot, it's going to go wing, 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 and now it never starts hard cold, but it does when it's hot for that reason, if it's been sitting for a while. Now the pressure regulator diaphragm can leak and cause extra fuel to go in there. I have actually I saw one truck that destroyed the engine because of a really bad fuel pressure regulator leak. The fuel gets past the diaphragm and it gets fed up through this vacuum, goes through that vacuum into the intake. And so you just basically got it dribbling gas in the intake, and if it dribbles enough in there, it can hydraulic lock 1 or more pistons, which is bad news if you got a good strong battery and a starter. When that piston comes up, I mean, it can just bust all kinds of stuff and ruin everything. All right, this is a 2007 Silverado with rich code, belonged to my friend. He sent me a text message with this picture that had been taken. He saw a check engine light, didn't feel any drivability problems. And his check engine light, when he went over to the parts store, they plugged in their little ANOVA scan tool and they got a PO175, fuel trim system rich bank 2, and he sends me the text, and I said, I don't know what that is off the top of my head, I mean, it won't usually be the oxygen sensor if you've got a rich code, because whenever an oxygen sensor dies, most of the time, it's going to die lean, and then it's going to show you a lean code. Even though your engine may be running rich on that bank, the oxygen sensor is going to be reading lean and that kind of stuff. So, and you may feel drivability issues on that. Some of the Dodges used to have the oxygen sensor fail at about 0.6 of a volt, and it would try to continually correct for that, even though the oxygen sensor wouldn't respond, and it would cause it to buck and jump and all kinds of stuff. You could look at the fuel trims, it looked like a big giant ugly sawtooth, more so than usual, So I went over there and I pulled his the code. Also, I got a 172 with my tablet, my Zurich scan tool that I paid $1,000 for at Harbor Freight. This is the screen print from that scan tool. And I gerrymandered his serial number down here because I didn't want anybody looking at his VIN number. It's just a privacy thing. But you might notice we had negative fuel trims on bank 1 and bank 2, both of them in double digits. So this is something common to both banks. Anytime you're looking at misfires or whatever, if it's something that's common to all of the cylinders, or if it's just isolated to one cylinder, that's an important piece of data. This one here they weren't equally subtracting, but they were both given negative numbers here. So that means just having to pull a lot of fuel out of there to keep it balanced. Okay, so I got to thinking about this. Now, I saw a 2004 Chevy Tahoe I talked about a few years ago that was really hard to start sometimes when it was cold. And the first couple of 3 times we started it cold, it didn't do that. But the next time it did. It was flex fuel. It would and it would wet the plugs. And the fuel compensation sensor on the scan tool was reading 45% alcohol. Basically that sensor puts out a signal, a hertz signal, you know, and we measured that too. But the owner never used anything but regular fuel, so we know it didn't have 45% alcohol in it, unless somebody had come and dumped some in there. Hadn't seen this before, but whenever it thinks there's alcohol in there, it overcompensates, puts too much fuel in there, because if it's got that much alcohol, it needs to put that much in there for the thing to start like it should. As it turns out, this is basically a sensor input that skews what the engine controller is doing with the fuel. Now, this Chevrolet Silverado had rich codes. It had 29% alcohol showing in the fuel alcohol content. And I said, this is like that other one. What I didn't see on the scan tool I was using on that Tahoe, and it was 3 years older than this truck, was I didn't see anything about resetting the fuel composition. But on this one, I did. I saw a little button. And you know, this thing was thinking it was 30% alcohol. It was over fueling, and the O2 sensors picked it up, subtracted the fuel, and to keep short fuel trim balance near zero, it was subtracting a substantial amount of fuel. Whenever those numbers get into double digits, that's when I get to worry about them. If they're bouncing around like 6 or 8, I don't bother them. But if they get into 11 or 12, that's when I start to take them seriously. The tool had a reset composition sensor prompt, so I did it. I reset it, and the new fuel composition sensor percentage dropped to 3.4. I typed that number in because I forgot to do a screen print of the new number reading, but that's what it read. And the new percentage dropped to 3.4 or so. The fuel trim's normalized. That was proof was in the pudding. And basically we cleared all of that out there and fired it up, and they all stayed, you know, real close to zero, down in single digits, just bouncing around there. And so all I had to do on this one was reset that fuel composition sensor with the Zurich scan tool, which is basically a launch scan tool, is what it basically amounts to. I just wanted a tablet tool so I could do a little bit more advanced work other than having to depend on somebody else's scan tool, you know. And so, anyway, so think carefully before you're changing parts. Gather good data, interpret it, and make the wisest choice that you can. Start with the cheap and easy probable stuff first, if you do decide to change parts, because it only makes sense. Like, for example, if you got an overheating problem and you don't see a busted hose somewhere, it's smarter to go ahead and put a thermostat in it if that's cheap and easy to get to, than it is to decide to put head gaskets on it before you've even checked the thermostat. Anyway, I appreciate you guys watching, and I hope you got something out of this that you can use, and we will see you next time.